They said he once watched a man fade into the dust and never moved, not even an inch, not even a breath, and out here in the wide, sunburned silence of West Texas, that kind of story sticks to a man like dried mud on boots, heavy and hard to shake loose. So when the Apache girl came crawling across the last 20 yards of cracked earth toward his cabin, dragging one leg behind her and leaving a faint line in the dust like a whisper no one else could hear, no one expected Silas Boone to do anything at all, not when he hadn't spoken more than a handful of words in 7 years, not when he lived 30 miles from the nearest town and kept his world smaller than the fence line he barely maintained, not when the wind itself seemed to respect his silence and move around him instead of through him. But that afternoon the light hit different, low and copper-colored, stretching long shadows from the dry mesquite trees, and Silas stood on his porch with one hand resting against the rough post, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of a hat worn thin by time, watching her the way a man watches something he doesn't yet understand and isn't sure he wants to. She didn't call out, didn't beg, didn't even raise her voice above the quiet rasp of breath pulled through a tired chest. She just kept moving inch by inch until the distance between them shrank to something that felt personal, something that felt like a choice waiting to be made. And still he didn't move, because that was who he had become. A man who let moments pass, a man who believed that staying still kept the world from asking anything of him. But then she lifted her head, just slightly, just enough for the fading sunlight to catch her eyes, and something in that look wasn't fear, wasn't anger, wasn't even hope. It was recognition, the kind that reaches across years without permission, the kind that settles in your chest before your mind can push it away. And Silas felt his fingers tighten against the wood, felt the old weight he carried shift just enough to remind him it was still there. The wind picked up, slow and steady, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain that would never reach this land, and behind that wind came the faintest echo of hoofbeats somewhere far off, too far to matter yet, but close enough to promise that time wasn't on anyone's side. She stopped moving then, not because she had reached safety, but because she had reached him, and for a long second that stretched longer than it should have. Neither of them said a word, because out here words didn't change anything, only choices did, and Silas Boone had built his life on refusing them. But those eyes held, steady, unblinking, as if they already knew what he was about to decide, as if they had seen him before he became this man made of silence. And somewhere deep in a place he hadn't visited in years, something stirred, quiet but undeniable, like a door not fully closed, waiting for a hand that had forgotten how to open it. Silas Boone did not believe in second chances, because the first ones had already taken everything from him, and the land he stood on reflected that belief. Dry, cracked, stubborn, a place where nothing grew unless it fought for every inch of life, and he had learned to live the same way, quiet, self-contained, needing no one and offering nothing in return. His cabin sat alone against the open stretch of West Texas, a structure of weathered wood and old nails that creaked with the wind but never gave in, much like the man inside it. And for 7 long years no one had crossed that threshold without being turned away by silence alone. Not threats, not anger, just the absence of welcome, which somehow felt heavier than either. But now the girl lay just beyond that threshold, her breath shallow but steady, her presence disrupting a routine built on emptiness, and Silas could feel it, that shift in the air that came when something unfamiliar refused to leave. He stepped down from the porch, slowly, boots pressing into the dust with a measured weight, each step deliberate as if the ground itself might object, his eyes never leaving hers, because there was something there that did not belong to this moment, something older, something that reached back into a memory he had buried deep beneath years of chosen silence. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the fine lines of dirt across her face, the way her hand tightened slightly against the earth as if holding on to the last bit of strength she had left, and still she did not speak, did not plead, did not lower her gaze. That alone was enough to unsettle him more than any words could have, because most people begged, most people tried to fill silence with noise, but she understood it, carried it the same way he did, like a shield, like a language only a few could hear. The wind brushed past them. Again, lifting strands of her dark hair across her face, and for a brief second, just a brief one, Silas saw another face in its place, softer, distant, half-remembered. Gone before he could grasp it, his jaw tightened, not in anger, but in resistance, the kind that comes when a man realizes he's about to break his own rules, the same rules that had kept him safe from the weight of other people's lives, from the choices that never left you once they were made. Behind him the cabin door creaked, slightly, tapping against its frame with the rhythm of the wind, a quiet reminder that stepping back inside would end this moment, would return everything to the way it had been, simple, silent, untouched, and for a second, that option lingered, tempting in its familiarity, but the sound of distant hoofbeats grew just a little clearer now, still far, still uncertain, but enough to press time forward, enough to force a decision that could not be undone. Silas exhaled slowly, a breath that carried more weight than it should have, and without a word, without warning, he reached down, his hand steady despite the tension in his chest, and lifted her, not gently, not roughly, just enough to bring her off the ground and toward the only place he had ever kept closed to the world. The cabin door swung wider as he stepped through, and for the first time in years, Silas Boone let someone cross that line, even if he did not yet understand why. The cabin held the kind of stillness that did not welcome interruption, a quiet built over years of keeping the world outside where it belonged, but now that stillness shifted, stretched thin by the presence of someone who did not fit into it, and Silas Boone felt at the moment he set her down on the narrow bed against the far wall, the wood frame creaking under even that small weight, as if it too resisted change. He stepped back immediately, putting distance between them, not out of fear, but out of habit, the same instinct that had kept him untouched by other people's burdens for so long. The room smelled of dry timber, worn leather, and the faint trace of coffee grounds long since gone cold. Nothing in it was made for comfort, only survival. And she seemed to understand that without needing it explained. Her eyes moved once across the space, slow and steady, taking in every corner, every shadow, as if memorizing it, not judging it, and that alone unsettled him more than anything else, because most who entered would look for something to question, something to challenge, but she did not. She simply existed within it, as if she had stepped into silence before and knew how to carry it. Silas turned toward the small table near the window, his movements deliberate, controlled, reaching for a canteen half full and a clean cloth folded beside it. These were simple actions, practical, the kind that required no thought, and that was why he chose them, because thinking led to memory, and memory led to places he had locked away for a reason. He poured a little water onto the cloth, the sound soft but sharp in the quiet room, and for a moment he paused, cloth in hand, as if the next step carried more weight than it should have. Then he stepped forward again, slower this time, and knelt beside the bed, not looking directly at her face, focusing instead on the small details he could control, the dust on her sleeve, the faint tremor in her hand, the steady rise and fall of her breathing. He reached out, careful, precise, and pressed the damp cloth lightly against her arm where the dirt had gathered, not as an act of care he recognized, but as something closer to duty, something he could justify without naming it. She did not pull away, did not flinch, just watched him, and after a few seconds, she spoke, her voice low, steady, shaped by effort but not weakness. "You are going to leave me." And the words hung in the air. Between them, simple, direct, impossible to ignore. Silas did not answer. Not because he could not, but because the truth did not require words. It was already there in the space between what he had done and what he almost had not. He set the cloth aside, stood again, turning slightly toward the window where the fading light stretched across the floorboards in long, narrow lines. Outside the wind had picked up again, carrying with it that distant sound, clearer now, hoofbeats, more than one, moving steady across open land, not rushing, not hiding, just coming, and Silas knew that whatever had followed her would not stop at his fence line, because out here lines only mattered to those who believed in them, and the people riding toward this place did not sound like they did. He glanced back once, just once, and found her eyes still on him, unchanged, unbroken, as if she had already seen the road ahead and was waiting to see if he would walk it, and for the first time in years, Silas. Boone felt the weight of a choice settle fully on his shoulders, not something he could step away from, not something silence could erase, but something that would follow him no matter which way he turned. The sound of hoofbeats carried closer now, no longer a distant suggestion but a steady rhythm pressing against the edges of the land, and Silas Boone stood still in the narrow space between the window and the door, listening the way a man listens when he knows what is coming but has not yet decided how to meet it. The girl on the bed shifted slightly, not in panic, not in fear, but in awareness, as if the same sound reached her in a language she understood better than he did. And when she spoke, again her voice was softer this time, but no less certain. "They are not the only ones looking." And that was all she said. No explanation, no urgency, just a statement that settled into the room like dust in sunlight. Silas did not ask who she meant because questions led to answers and answers led to ties, and he had spent years cutting every tie he had ever known, but the truth was already forming whether he wanted it or not. There were always two sides out here, sometimes more, and none of them came without a reason. He reached for his hat from the peg by the door, not in a rush, not as a reaction, but as a man preparing to step into something he could not avoid. His movements remained controlled, measured, as if keeping that rhythm might keep everything else from unraveling. He paused with the hat in his hand, glancing once more toward the bed, toward the girl whose presence had already changed more than he was willing to admit. Her eyes met his again, steady, unwavering, and there was no demand in them, no expectation, only that same quiet recognition that had followed him from the moment she crossed his land, and it stirred something deeper now, something tied to a memory he could not fully see but could not ignore either, a fragment of another time, another face, another pair of eyes that had looked at him not with fear but with trust, and the weight of that memory pressed against his chest in a way that made standing still feel heavier than moving forward. Outside, the light had shifted further toward dusk, the sky stretching wide in shades of amber and fading blue, and the land around the cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The hoofbeats slowed, not because they had turned away, but because they had reached the boundary, the place where strangers decided whether to cross or call out, and for a long second, there was nothing but wind again. Then a voice carried across the open space, low but clear, not raised, not demanding, just present. Boone. The name landed without surprise, without question. Whoever wrote out there knew exactly where they were and who they had come to find. Silas placed the hat on his head, the motion final in a way that words could never be, and stepped toward the door, his hand resting briefly on the worn wood before pushing it open. The air outside felt different now, heavier, filled with more than just dust and wind. A small group of riders waited beyond the fence line, their figures still against the fading light, not aggressive, not relaxed, simply watching, and in that silence, in that space between movement and stillness, Silas Boone understood something he had spent years avoiding. That silence did not keep the world away, it only delayed the moment when it arrived, and now it had. The riders did not cross the fence, not yet, and that alone told Silas Boone more than words ever could, because men who intended trouble rarely waited for permission, they took it. But these men held their ground, still as the land itself, their horses shifting only slightly beneath them, breathing slow in the cooling air, and the man at the front sat straight in his saddle, not tense, not relaxed, just certain. The kind of certainty that came from knowing exactly why you had come. Silas stepped down from the porch, boots meeting the dirt with that same measured weight, closing the distance one step at a time until he stood just inside the boundary line, not crossing, not retreating, simply placing himself where he needed to be. The wind moved between them, carrying dust in thin lines that curled and disappeared just as quickly, and for a moment no one spoke, because out here silence was not empty. It was part of the conversation. The man on horseback tilted his head slightly, studying Silas with eyes that had seen enough to recognize what stood in front of him. "You have someone in that cabin," he said, not asking, not accusing, just stating what he already knew. Silas did not answer, his gaze steady beneath the brim of his hat, and that silence stretched long enough to confirm the truth without a single word. The rider nodded once, as if that was all he needed, then shifted his weight slightly forward. Not a threat, not a demand, just a step closer to the purpose that had brought him here. She crossed land that does not belong to her, he continued, his voice even, controlled. And others are looking for her as well. The words settled between them, simple and clear, and Silas understood what was being said beneath them, that this was not just one path leading to his door, but several, and each one carried its own claim, its own reason, its own version of what was right. He could feel the weight of the cabin behind him, the quiet presence of a girl inside, and the choice he had already made without admitting it. He lifted his hand slightly, not toward a weapon, not toward anything that would escalate what stood between them, just enough to rest against the top rail of the fence, grounding himself in something solid, something real. The rider watched that small movement closely, not reacting, just noting it, and after a moment he spoke again, softer now. This does not have to become something it is not. And that line lingered in the air, because it offered a path that required no force, no confrontation, only agreement, only the quiet act of stepping aside. The kind of choice Silas Boone had made his entire life, the easy one, the one that kept everything distant and untouched, but something had shifted, something that did not allow that path to feel the same anymore. Behind him the cabin door creaked faintly in the wind, a small sound that carried further than it should have, and for a brief second the rider's eyes flicked past Silas toward that door, then back again. And in that glance the space between them changed, not with tension, not with threat, but with understanding, because now it was no longer about what might be inside, but about whether Silas would stand between it and the world or step aside like he always had. The sky darkened another shade, the last of the light stretching thin across the horizon, and the land held that quiet pause where everything waited for the next move, and Silas Boone remained exactly where he stood, saying nothing, doing nothing. But for the first time in years, that stillness did not mean absence, it meant decision. The man on horseback waited, and that waiting carried more weight than any demand could have, because it left the choice exactly where it belonged, on Silas Boone, and the land itself seemed to lean into that moment, the wind easing just enough to let every small sound travel farther than it should, the creak of saddle leather, the slow breath of horses, the faint shift of boots against dry earth, and behind all of it, quieter but no less present, the memory that had begun to surface in Silas's mind, not clear, not complete, but persistent, like a shadow that refused to stay buried. He could see fragments now, a different stretch of land, greener, years ago, a figure standing where the girl now stood, eyes just as steady, just as unafraid, and the feeling that came with it was not pride, not regret, but something unfinished, something left behind when he chose silence over action. The rider in front watched him carefully, not pressing, not rushing, as if he too understood that what stood between them was not distance but decision. "You know how this ends if you step aside," the rider said quietly, and there was no threat in the words, only certainty, the kind that came from experience, from seeing how these moments usually played out, a man alone, a choice made, a life returned to its path as if nothing had changed, but something had already changed. Silas could feel it in the way his hand no longer rested easy against the fence, in the way his gaze did not drift but held steady, in the way the silence around him no longer felt like protection but like a weight pressing inward. Behind him the cabin door shifted again, just enough to remind him of what stood on the other side, not as a burden, not as a problem, but as something that had crossed into his world and refused to be ignored, and for the first time in years, he understood that silence was not the same as peace, it was only the absence of decision, and that absence had cost more than he had been willing to admit. The rider's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition of that shift, small as it was, and he adjusted his posture in the saddle, not forward, not back, simply preparing for whatever came next. The other men behind him remained still, their presence steady, not aggressive, but undeniable, a reminder that this moment was not isolated, that it connected to something larger than the space between a cabin and a fence line. Silas exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it should have, and without looking back, Without breaking the line of sight between himself and the man in front of him, he moved, not away, not aside, but forward one step past the fence line, into the open space where decisions could no longer be avoided. The dust shifted beneath his boots, the sound quiet but final, and though he still said nothing, the meaning was clear. In the way he stood there, not blocking, not threatening, simply present in a way he had not been for years, and in that presence, in that single step, something long buried found its way to the surface, not fully understood, not yet named, but strong enough to change the course of what would come next. The dust settled slowly around Silas Boone's boots as he stood beyond the fence line, and that single step changed the shape of everything without a word being spoken. The rider saw it, understood it, not as a challenge, not as defiance, but as something far rarer out here, a man choosing to stand where he once would have walked away, and the lead rider let out a quiet breath, not frustration, not approval, just acknowledgement, because he had seen men make that choice before and knew it never came without a cost. "You are stepping into something that does not belong to you," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the open space without force, and Silas did not respond, but his posture answered well enough, shoulders set, weight balanced, not preparing for a fight, not seeking one, just refusing to move back, and that refusal carried its own kind of weight. Behind him the cabin remained still, but the presence inside it no longer felt distant. It felt connected to the ground, beneath his feet, to the air between him and the riders, as if the line he had crossed could not be undone. One of the men behind the leader shifted slightly in his saddle, not out of impatience, but awareness, because the moment had stretched long enough to change meaning. What began as a simple retrieval had become something else, something that required more than just reaching out and taking. The lead rider raised a hand slightly, not to signal action, but to hold the moment steady, his eyes never leaving Silas, studying him with a kind of quiet respect that did not need to be spoken aloud. "Others are coming," he said after a pause, softer now, "and they will not wait the way we have." And that truth settled into the space between them, heavier than anything before it, because it carried a future neither of them could fully control. The wind shifted again, this time bringing with it a second sound, faint but distinct, different from the steady rhythm of the riders in front, faster, less measured, still distant but closing, and Silas heard it, recognized the difference without needing to see it. The land spoke in patterns, and he had lived on it long enough to understand when something moved with purpose instead of patience. The lead rider heard it too, his gaze flicking briefly toward the horizon before returning. And in that brief glance there was something new, not concern, not fear, but urgency held in check. He leaned forward slightly in the saddle, just enough to close a fraction of the distance between them. "When they arrive," he said, "they will not ask who she belongs to, they will decide." And that word hung there, decide, because out here decisions made without understanding rarely ended clean. Silas Boone remained still, but something inside him had already shifted beyond return, the memory pressing against him now clearer, the shape of it forming. A moment years ago when he had stood just like this and chosen nothing, chosen silence, chosen absence, and the result of that choice had followed him ever since, quiet but constant, and now the same weight stood before him again, not as a punishment, not as fate, but as a chance to answer differently. He did not look back toward the cabin, did not need to, because he already knew what was there, and more importantly, he knew what he was no longer willing to be, the man who stepped aside, the man who let the world take what it wanted without standing in its way. The approaching sound grew slightly louder, enough to press the moment forward, enough to remove any illusion that time would stretch longer, and in that narrowing space between what was and what was coming, Silas Boone stood firm, not as a barrier, not as a threat, but as something far more difficult to move, a man who had finally chosen to remain. The second sound came over the horizon like a line drawn too fast across the land, sharper, less patient, and it changed the air before the riders even appeared, because everyone standing there knew what it meant when movement carried that kind of urgency. The lead rider's gaze shifted once more toward the distance, then back to Silas Boone, and something unspoken passed between them, not agreement, not alliance, but recognition that the moment had reached its edge. This is where choice becomes consequence, the writer said quietly, not as a warning, but as a truth already in motion, and Silas did not respond, because he had already stepped into that truth the moment he crossed the fence. Behind him the cabin door moved again, slower this time, and a faint sound followed, not a cry, not a call, just the soft shift of someone who knew what was coming and refused to hide from it. The girl stepped into the doorway, not fully outside, not yet, but enough for the fading light to catch her face, and when the lead writer saw her, something in his expression changed, subtle, controlled, but undeniable. Recognition not of her alone, but of something she carried, something tied to more than just this land. Silas did not turn, did not need to, because he felt that shift the same way he felt the wind change before a storm. The approaching riders came into view then, silhouettes first, then form, a small group moving faster than the first, their horses cutting across the open ground with purpose that did not leave room for pause, and as they closed the distance, the space between all sides tightened, not with noise, not with chaos, but with something far heavier, expectation. The lead rider in front of Silas did not move to intercept, did not draw anything, did not raise his voice. He simply remained where he was, as if holding a line that could not be seen but was clearly felt, and when the second group slowed within calling distance, their leader's voice carried across the land, firm, certain. She comes with us. No question, no hesitation, just a claim spoken into the open air, the kind that expected to be followed, and for a brief second, everything held still, the wind, the dust. Even the horses seemed to pause between breaths, waiting not for force, but for response. Silas Boone stood between both sides, not at the center of a conflict, but at the center of a decision that now belonged fully to him, and in that stillness, the girl stepped forward from the doorway, just one step, enough to stand where the light met shadow, her eyes moving from one group to the other before settling on Silas, and in that look, something passed that words could not carry, something older than this moment, deeper than the lines drawn across the land, and Silas felt it fully now, the memory no longer a fragment, but a shape. A moment years ago when he had stood before someone just like this and chosen to turn away, chosen silence over action. And the weight of that choice had never left him, it had only waited, and now it stood in front of him again, not as a burden, but as a chance. The lead rider behind the first group spoke then, his voice lower, steadier. She is not what they think, and that line shifted everything, not loudly, not suddenly, but enough to break the simple shape of claim and response, enough to turn certainty into question. And for the first time since the riders arrived, the moment did not belong to either side. It belonged to the truth waiting to be seen, and Silas Boone, who had spent years refusing to see anything beyond his own silence, stood there with the weight of that truth pressing against him, knowing that whatever he did next would not just decide her fate, but finally answer the question he had been avoiding for years, not who she was, but who he chose to be. The wind slowed as if the land itself had decided to listen, and in that quiet stretch between men who had come for answers and a girl who carried more than they understood, Silas Boone finally moved, not fast, not sudden, but with a kind of still certainty that could not be mistaken. He stepped back one pace, not away from the riders, not away from the moment, but closer to the girl, placing himself where the line between her and the world could no longer be crossed without passing through him. And he reached up slowly, his hand finding the thin cord beneath his shirt, the one thing he had never let go, not even when he let go of everything else. The small pendant came into the fading light, dull from years of wear, but unmistakable in its shape, and when the girl saw it, her breath caught. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to shift the air, because she knew it, not as an object, but as something carried through stories, through memory, through a voice she had once listened to in the quiet hours before sleep, the voice of a mother who had spoken of a man who stood at the edge of a choice and could not step forward, not because he was cruel, but because he was afraid of what staying might cost him. And now that man stood in front of her, older, worn by silence, but no longer turning away, The writer saw it too. The way her eyes changed, the way the space between them shifted from claim to understanding, and the lead writer who had spoken first lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in respect for something that did not belong to him to decide, while the second group, the ones who had arrived with urgency, held their place, their certainty thinning in the face of something they had not expected, something that could not be forced into a simple ending. Silas did not speak, because words would have broken what was forming. Instead, he let the pendant fall back against his chest, a quiet return, and took one final step forward, closing the distance between himself and the girl, not touching, not guiding, just standing where she could choose her own direction without being pulled by either side. And that was the moment everything changed, not with movement, not with command, but with absence of both. The riders looked to one another, the silence stretching long enough to replace tension with something else, recognition that the path forward no longer required them. One by one, without signal, without announcement, the men on horseback began to turn, not retreating, not conceding, simply leaving the moment where it belonged, on the ground where it had been decided. The second group lingered a second longer, their leader watching Silas as if measuring something unseen. Then he gave a small nod, not to the girl, not to the others, but to the man who had chosen to stand when it mattered, and he too turned his horse, the sound of hooves fading into the distance the same way they had arrived, until only wind remained again, soft, steady, unchanged. Silas stood there for a long moment after they were gone, not moving, not looking back, because he did not need to see her to know she was still there. The weight that had followed him for years felt different now, not gone, not erased, but settled, like dust after a long ride, and when he finally turned, the girl was already walking, not toward him, not away from him, but forward, across the open land, carrying her own path the way she always had. She paused once, just once, and looked back, not with gratitude, not with obligation, but with that same quiet recognition that had started it all, and then she was gone into the wide horizon, leaving Silas Boone alone again, but not the same man who had once stood in silence and done nothing, because out here, a man is not remembered for the words he speaks, but for the moment he chooses to stay, and this time, he did.